This is Joel Wakenaut on October 18th, 2003, interviewing Juan Lujan for the U.S. Latino and Latino World War II Oral History Project. We're sitting in the Vet Center in Austin, Texas on William Cannon Drive. And thank you, Mr. Lujan, for agreeing to be interviewed. So, start before the war. Tell me about your family and what your daily life was like growing up.
I was born and grew up in a small rural community in West Texas. Redford. Most people haven't heard of Redford, so I tell them it's below Presidio. And they generally know where Presidio is because in the summer it generally has the hottest temperatures. And so it's down the river from Presidio, about 16 miles. And at the time I grew up there and lived there, the road ended there. You couldn't go through Redford. You had to go to Redford. Since then, they have cut a road along the river to the Big Bend National Park called the River Road. So now it has communications from both ends. And I went to school there, elementary school. My father was a farmer. My big brother helped him toward the later years. It was my big brother that was doing most of the work. My father was getting on in years and sick. And when I was in the middle of my 6th grade, my father died. And soon after that, my brother moved us to Marfa. Marfa was the county seat of Presidio County. Something interesting that if my father had lived, of course it's nice to have a father, but if my father had lived, my education probably would have ended in 6th grade, because that's as far as that school went. It belonged to the Marfa Independent School District. The high school was 75 miles away. Those people that had money could rent a house in Marfa so that their sons and their daughters could live out there or with relatives. In my case, the chances are very good that my education would have been there. So I view my father's death with an ambivalent tone, that it was in a way good, in a way bad. Of course, it's always bad to lose your father.
Yeah. So, did y'all struggle economically?
Yes. Early on, things were good. I was born in 22. So apparently the years 22 to 28, 29 were good. There was a lot of money. My father was a cotton farmer. In fact, cotton was the only cash crop. There were a lot of things grown, but mostly for home consumption. Corn, beans, pumpkins, all kinds of vegetables and fruits. All that was for consumption. It was unthinkable that you would sell your fruit. No, you gave it away. What you sold was the cotton. And it would have to be taken by wagon 16 miles up to Presidio, where they had a gin. And generally the price of cotton was rather high when you were planting it. But at the time you were harvesting and selling it, it really wasn't that high. But as I said, apparently things were good in my early youth. It was until about the 30s that the Depression really hit. But one thing I do remember about Redford, we lived in an unbelievably primitive society. We had no electricity. We had no running water. Of course, we had no telephones. There were dangers of floods to the farms because there were no dams up up the river until you got to Elephant Butte in New Mexico. So when the floods came, sometimes they would devastate areas. And the only warning we got was an airplane flying and dropping messages printed in paper and with a weight, a rock or something to it. And when they said it was going to be so many feet, the people there knew that so many feet the water would reach up until that field out there. If it was higher, it would reach up to here. So in some cases you did nothing. In some cases you'd go out and pull the crops out, whatever you could salvage. Years later, I went by and visited my old house, old home. And I felt they had defaced it. There was a power meter. You had electric power meter on the outside. What's that thing doing there? So we had nothing.
So what was it like growing up in a community like that? It's a very tight-knit community, people.
Well, we were poor and didn't know it. Everybody was poor. We had 2 or 3 that had more land than the rest. They hired people to help them do the crops. They owned the stores. And those were what I'd say the leaders of the community. And those were the people that would have, say, windmills so that they could dig wells. They didn't drill at that time. You dig it. Anybody could dig a well down to 20, 25 feet and you could find water, but it was not necessarily good water. Sometimes you'd have to get a little farther away. To describe that community, the river went north and south, and sort of southeast northwest, where the Big Bend starts. Big Bend is really a big bend in the river. And as you got farther away from the river, then you had a chance of getting better water because it was water that came from the mountains. There were springs up in those mountains, and of course that water was running down on the water table. Now, between us and the farms, between our homes, the homes and the farms, there was an irrigation ditch. And that ditch had water most of the time, and that's where we drank water from the ditch. We also had a well, but it was not very, very tasty, but it was good drinking well. And we were poor, but we never starved. In a farm, being poor means you don't have money. You might not have clothes. You might not have many of those things like that. But as far as food, hey, you were going to have food. If you didn't, then the neighbors would see to it that you did. So it was a closely knit community. Hardly anybody from that community could marry anybody else from that community.
Why is that?
They were all interrelated, cousins. So when they'd have dances, they would always invite boys from other areas from out of there. And our brothers, I had a big brother, brothers and cousins and others would go to dances somewhere else, somewhere right across the river to El Mulato, a small town on the Mexican side, or Loma de Juarez, a bunch of little towns on the other side. So it was that way. It wasn't until, really I guess until after I left there, that people from the outside started coming in, and I don't really know why they started coming in. At one time, my brother and a friend took a census of Redford, and it had 300 people.
300 people.
And the chances are that right now it has a few more or a few less, but it hasn't varied that much. So that was my what I'd say my early childhood.
So tell me, you said education was very important to you. Tell me about your school years growing up. How far did you finish high school before you went to the war, or were you in the
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, I transferred to Marfa. I was surprised when I got my report card to take to the principal at Marfa. He said, take this to the principal of the Marfa Mexican School. And I had some friends that had gone to school with me that had moved across the river to Mexico, and I considered that a Mexican school. So when he said a Mexican school, I didn't really know what he meant.
So the schools were segregated between?
Yes, in Redford, they could not be segregated. There were only Mexican Americans. There were no Anglos, except teachers, border patrolmen that came in and out, and fishermen, hunters, but the population was 100% Mexican American. Some born on this side, some born in Mexico. So Marfa had a high school, and at the high school building they had the elementary grades for the Anglos, but they had a separate one for the Mexicans. So that's where I started mid-year. And to me, Marfa was a big place. Not that I was not familiar with it. I had a cousin. My aunt, my godparents lived in Marfa, so I had been there to visit. But to visit is one thing, to live is something else. So we were supposed from sixth grade we were supposed to pass on to seventh grade and then go to the other school, the high school. So we went and stayed there 2 weeks, and then they sent us back because there was no room out there. By that time, of course, they had grown and this other one had grown, so we were going to have seventh grade at the same place where we had sixth grade. And then the following year, eighth grade also, and ninth grade. So my schooling there was not going to be that good. But something unfortunate happened to a gentleman teacher from Goose Creek, Texas. His wife was diagnosed with tuberculosis. And at that time there was no cure for tuberculosis. What would alleviate it would be to live in a dry climate. So from very humid, Goose Creek is in the Houston area. So from the very humid Goose Creek to dry Marfa, his wife was doing well. So his misfortune turned out to be our fortune. He happened to have a degree from the University of Texas, a master's degree in English and Spanish from the University of Mexico. So he was a good teacher. So for those 2 years that I normally would have been sentenced to poor schooling, actually I got pretty good schooling.
Wow.
And I stayed in that school until the end of ninth grade. And that is at that time my life changed. So let me just take a break. If you have any questions about something in my past that I might not have touched on.
Okay, yeah, I'd actually like to touch more on the fact that you went from a city that was entirely Mexican American to a city where that was segregated. How did that affect you? Realizing the segregation within our society, whereas you hadn't been exposed to that before.
I think it affected my mother, and it affected the adults a lot more because they knew what was going on. We didn't. We figured this is the way it is. Some of our teachers tried to do the best with what they had. For instance, in the other school, they participated in many activities of interscholastic league. We didn't. So some of the teachers of the various Mexican schools, Marfa was not isolated. Alpine had segregated schools, and Fort Duck and many others. They got together and they decided, let's organize activities so that these kids can get the experiences that normally they would if they were in a integrated situation. So they announced that we would have this and that and the other to be practicing because we were going to have a meet in Fort Stockton. So we went. I was competing in spelling, math. No, I was competing in spelling. Somebody was competing in math. Others were competing in declamations. There were, and I guess they still have those declamations competition. The Texas Interscholastic League probably still does a lot of that. So we managed to get some of the materials that they used there, and some of our teachers coached us on what to do. And on the day of the meet, we piled up in a pickup truck and went up there to attend the meet. And I was good at spelling, but I was not very good at writing. And later on, when they explained how the spelling of words was graded, if there was a doubt as to whether this thing was an O or an A, they would isolate it, and a third person would look at it. If he could tell what it was, and that was what that word needed, then you'd get it right. Well, I missed several because my writing was not understandable. And since then, it has gone downhill.
I'm right there with you on that.
Just before we got there, we hit a bump, and one of our boys fell off. He was our math whiz, and he got up wondering what was going on. He started getting little pebbles from his ears, but he was all right. Went ahead and competed. Well, he didn't do worth a darn in the competition, but he was not all right. Later on, things came out. Nothing very serious, but it discombobulated it. But anyway, we did have that experience. One experience I had by observing, I saw a bunch of boys, bigger than I was, out there singing their heart out. They were competing in choir. I had never ever seen boys of that kind. I had seen men that would sing because they were drunk, but here was something, and I think, I wish I had that. Well, I never did, and to this day, I feel that I had a fairly good basic education, but there's a big art and music void. There has been, still is, in my life that I had missed it.
Would you say that's reflected in the community at large there because no one else either had those opportunities that?
Oh, well, others had it at the other school. They did.
But I mean, within the
Yes.
Mexican American
Yes.
community, there, would you say there's
Yes.
a void there as well?
There were so many things that now looking back at it, you're not discriminated at very, very openly and vicious. Just little things. It's the little things that count.
All right. So you said there was a change in your life. So do you want a drink of water or anything?
No,
by the way?
no, I'm okay.
Okay.
My brother, who had been in the CCC, when they were building the Indian Lodge at Fort Davis. His tour of duty, I think they would let them stay 2 years and then they'd have to get out. So he got out and he was working the railroad in Marfa, section hand. And then he was a cousin of ours that had left Redford many years earlier, was living in California, came by to visit and told him, hey, there's a lot of work in California, farm work. So he talked him into going. So he got married, and he and his bride went off to California, to Stockton, and said that in the summer, then he'd send me a ticket so that I could go and work during the summer. And that happened. In the summer, I got my ticket, took the train, went to Los Angeles, changed trains there. They were picking me up at Stockton. So I worked in the beet fields. There was all kinds of farm labor.
I'm sorry, how old were you at this time?
I was 16.
Okay.
I was 16. And they were making I was making the fabulous amount of 35 cents an hour. Now, 35 cents an hour, you might think it's nothing, but nothing is nothing. In Marfa, there was nothing to do, no work, no work. And if there was work, it would probably wind up paying $1 a day. So 35 cents an hour was money. So I was sending some money back to my mother, who stayed in Marfa.
Did you have any other brothers and sisters in Marfa, or just your mother?
My mother and a sister. I grew up with a brother and 2 sisters. Before we left Redford, my older sister had got married, and she stayed in Redford. And my older brother was the one that had sort of been supporting us. And my younger sister was, she had something that was never really quite diagnosed. It was like a form of paralysis, but not total paralysis. She just had difficulty walking and doing things. So when the job that we went to do to begin with was over, there was something else and something else and something else. So come September, and I really didn't go back home because we were working, trying to make money to go back to Marfa to pick up my mother and take her to live with us in California. Well, we didn't make it back to Marfa until just before Christmas, with some money. Not a lot of money, but some money. And my mother would not leave. She didn't want to leave. She didn't want to go to California. So we stayed. In fact, my brother also stayed. He got other jobs here and there. And I couldn't go back to school because it was the middle of the year, and at that time you started in September. So I missed that year. That would have been my 10th grade. Now, by that time, that would have been at the regular high school, the integrated high school. So, at graduation that May, at that time school was over about the middle of May. I went and came home, and according to my mother, I cried all night. So she decided, you are going to school next September. So I did, one way or another. At that time, something that had been starting, part of the programs that the Roosevelt administration brought in. And now they call it welfare. At that time, it was called relief. So my mother was going to get some money, and we were going to get some food, surplus, whatever, vegetables. And I could work on Saturdays and after school. So somehow I made it. Made it through 10th grade.
Oh, I'm sorry, you went back to California? This is
No,
you were in
no, I didn't go back to
Okay, you were in
California.
Bar.
I didn't go back to California.
Just to verify that.
And 11th grade, then I graduated. At that time, many schools, I don't know if it was most of them, but many schools went through 11th. Gradually, more and more were adding another year. That one added another year about 2 or 3 years after I graduated. But I graduated from 11th grade. All right, as part of the relief, the representative that visited my mother tried to help us, had suggested to my mother that I might join the CCCs. So she made the arrangements, and soon after graduation, I joined the CCCs, and they sent me to Jesus Mountains, where that company was developing the Big Bend National Park. It was not a Big Bend, a park yet, but it was a designated, it was going to be a national park. So I did some learning because the CCCs provided many opportunities. It was work and education programs, working on the job. My brother, for instance, when he had worked earlier with the CCCs in the construction of the Indian Lodge at the Fort Davis State Park, he had learned carpentry. So he did a lot of work as a carpenter later on. So we were building, starting the foundations of the lodge that is still standing there. And we would work so many hours, and then so many hours would be class. The foreman explaining blueprints. Most of us had not seen blueprints, that we didn't know how houses or how things were built. So he explained blueprints and measurements, and the blueprints were in feet and tenths of feet. And when he ran into something that said this is 3 and 3/10 feet, how many inches would that be? And I figured it out. So I became sort of the straw boss of that group. There were few college graduates in that CCC. There were some, but the bulk of those boys were dropouts. So those of us that had high school diploma had a little advantage. There was a museum there because to this day they're finding very interesting geological finds, bones and whatnot. And there was a museum there of bones that they had found, dinosaur bones, some thigh bones there that were about 2.5 feet long, and other things in the museum. So I became, they called me the curator. I didn't even know what the curator was. Later on, when I found out, I figured, that was a fast promotion. Anyway, I was a guide. They explained to me a lot of the things that they had there so that I would explain to the tourists. I guess I was more proficient in both English and Spanish. So I was a natural selection for that. And I was enjoying it. We'd take trips, the trucks would take us. You had a choice of going to, well, it was the same truck that would drop you off at Marathon if you wanted to, or at Alpine, or Marfa. Most of the ones that were there were from those three towns. If you were from somewhere else, there was no transportation for those places. So I'd go regularly back home to Marfa to party with my friends and whatnot. And then a memo came down from Fort Bliss, which was the headquarters of our company. The CCC was organized in two sectors. The ones that housed you, that was the Army's responsibility. Army clothing, Army regulations, rules, not as strict as in the Army, but that type. They had an Army doctor. The officers were, generally it was a commanding officer. It was a second in command called the subaltern. And there was the educational consultant, educational director, and then there was the doctor. Those four constituted the staffing, the professional staffing. The rest of the staffing was from enrollees themselves. If you had been there beyond your 18 months or 2 years, I don't remember exactly what it was, and they needed you badly, then they could let you stay and designated you as a project assistant. And the rankings they had was, the pay was $30 a month, of which they gave you 5, and 30 went home. And if you were promoted to assistant leader, then that was another $6, so you get 36. And if you were a leader, then you'd make $45. There were only 2 or 3 leaders. The sergeant, first sergeant, he had been from among the enrollees but promoted. And there were about 2 what they call project directors, more experienced and in charge of many of the enrollees. So the bulk of the money was going home, and we didn't really need that much. There was a canteen there where we could buy things, but almost everything was issued to us. We'd have to buy toothpaste and those that smoked, cigarettes, but everything else was provided. So a memo came down indicating that any enrollee who had who was a high school graduate and would be interested in transferring to a place where there was a college could apply. So I applied, and I was approved. I was approved to be transferred to a CCC camp in Las Cruces, New Mexico, to attend what they called New Mexico A&M. Since then it had changed to New Mexico State. And that started the next phase of my life. Let's review anything from the past that you feel I might not have touched on.
Just wondering kind of about, so in the CCCs, when you work on those, you live there away from home? With
barracks
okay.
Type, military type.
Very military style. How was the interaction like within the group there? Were you pretty close with a lot of the guys there, and especially with the racial mix of people? How was that?
No, there was no racial mix.
There was no racial mix?
The first sergeant was Anglo. And there was another one, I don't remember what his position was, but it was all Mexican American.
And how long did you work in the CCC there?
Well, in that one,
In that
it
one?
was, let's see, I went in June, about the beginnings of June, and stayed there through December,
Okay.
that one.
Do you ever go back to the museum that you curated to see?
No, later on, I found out it had burned down.
Oh, no.
It had burned down.
Oh,
But later on, I've been back to the Big Bend Park. One time just to visit, another time because we went on a rafting trip down the river.
How does it feel to be have been a part of helping develop what is now that?
Well,
state?
I thought there was no justice because we tried to get a room at the lodge that I had to work at the very beginnings of it, and no, I should put in for a reservation 3 months or 6 months earlier. So
Oh, no.
they were looking fine. In fact, they had added more, and even now a lot of people, students during the spring break like to go there, except that don't ever go there in the summer. It's fun and whatnot, but it's just too hot.
I believe that. So how old were you when you went over to Las Cruces?
Okay, it was the beginning of 1941, so I was 19.
And how long were you there before, or how did you hear about World War II starting? Tell me about your experience.
I was the CCC camp at Las Cruces, and we could attend. We could take only about half a load because they put us in a crew that had the odd hours to permit us to have a Monday morning off, Wednesday all day off, and Saturday morning, no, Friday morning off. So when everybody else had Saturday off, we worked Saturday. Anyway, we put in the required 40 hours in an adjusted schedule. And the job that I did, I was in a gopher crew. That's why I'd like to say, if you want higher education, go for it. I actually go for it. The Mesilla Valley, that's the name of the valley, and Las Cruces, it starts about 20 miles up and reaches on down. It stopped by El Paso because the mountain comes out to the river, but when it continues, then that's the lower El Paso Valley, and no longer the Mesilla Valley. So the gopher crew would be catching gophers because the land is irrigated. Few canals were concrete lined, most of them were not. And gophers burrow. And if they burrowed through the side of a canal and they punched a hole, that water would start going out slowly, and in no time at all, the whole side of the canal would collapse. So they did a lot of damage. So we would catch the gophers, and we'd carry traps in a big ring of wire, and we'd have a probe. It would be looked like a horrible weapon, but at the end it had something like a bayonet small, then a crossbar for us to use with our foot to drive it in where it was hard, and then this one was a pipe, a little bigger. So when we'd see the mounds, we knew by the shape of the mound which way the entrance was. And at the entrance, that entrance went to connect to a tunnel. became an expert in gophers. And we would go on the left side or the right side, either way, of the tunnel. We would dig and set a trap, mean-looking traps with a spring that would just, if you trip the trigger, it would just grab. Most of the time, it would kill the gopher. And we would cover it with moist soil, and then stick our finger through it to put a little light. That light disturbs them, so they have to go out there to plug it, and then they'd get caught. That was the idea behind it. And every week, well, every day we would have pulled off the tip of the tail, just the skin, put them in a little matchbox, and we had a count of the number we caught. And every week, the one that caught the most that week would get half day off the following week. And the one that had lost the least traps would also get a half day off, because we would lose traps. Sometimes the gopher would not be caught very well, and he'd take it in, and goodness knows where it was. That was gone. Sometimes people would just find it and take it. So I figured that in a period of about almost 2 years, I walked the length of the Mesilla Valley about twice, because by the time we got to the south end, it was time to start at the other end also. So it was interesting, provided us with the opportunity to start college that we might never have had. And I was there when war was declared, and we found out later on that the CCCs, because of the training they had for Army life, CCC enrollees going into the military service melded right in as though they had been in service before, because we had been in a certain way. We didn't get that training, but we didn't march, but we would stand in line for inspection and whatnot, the way they do in the Army. Plus, there were several jobs, like for instance, the clerk. The clerks were very needed in the Army, so they went up right away. There were cooks. By the way, the school there in the camp at Las Cruces also had a cooks and bakers school. So they turned out a lot of cooks and bakers. And there was a ready market. So sometimes when we had a particularly good meal, those of us in the CCCs would say, "You must have been trained in Las Cruces." Or if it was a particularly bad meal, I guess he was trained in Las Cruces. So when war was declared, things didn't change much, but everybody knew that things were going to change. And sure enough, soon we started getting news.
Is this when you say everybody, or do you mean the people within the CCC?
Yes.
Okay.
And they tell us, whenever they get memos, they tell us that they were phasing it out because so many of them were eligible. Besides, the ones that the CCCs would draw on were precisely the ones that the military were drawing on. And my last 6 months, I was not at the Gopher crew. Well, let me backtrack just a little. That company that they had there in Las Cruces was a Pennsylvania company. So we, being Texans and New Mexicans, we could not be members of that company because that was not the state that we belonged to. So sometime around the summer of 42, yeah, summer of 42, the Pennsylvania company was sent back to Pennsylvania, and they brought in a Texas company that had been working somewhere in the Rio Grande Valley. So since that was a Texas company, then I could join that. Those of us from Texas could join that company. The other ones that were from New Mexico or wherever else, they would still be attached, but they could not join. So now that I could join, then I could get a promotion to assistant leader, and I was the one in charge of the infirmary, because there had to be someone there all the time. And now I didn't sleep in the barracks. There was a room there for me, because I had to be there in case anybody came and needed first aid. I'd give them first aid. If they needed more than that, I could wake the doctor up. So I was there from about, well, I don't remember the month, but it was about July or August of 1942. Of 1941, yeah. War had not been declared just yet. 1941, and then when war was declared, then's when we got the notification or the explanation why that other company was being sent back to Pennsylvania. It was going to be disbanded, and many other companies were being disbanded, and ours probably would be disbanded. Later on we found out that yes, ours would be disbanded the following summer. So as soon as school was out, the university, then I could get out if I wanted to. So I did. I left the CCC, went back home. They were building an air base, and I started working there. But the important part of that phase was that it gave me a taste of something that I never thought was for me. College, seeing a college, even at Sioux Ross, where I had many of my cousins attend college. To me, college was for somebody that was rich, that had money. So college would never be for me. So the idea that I could attend college one way or another, figured, well. But I knew that my time as a civilian, my days were numbered. I promised my mother I would not volunteer, but every day I'd go see how my number was doing, and I guess they got the message. My number came up and I was drafted.
So when were you drafted?
I was drafted in November
Of 42?
November 42.
Okay.
So I had a summer and about 6 months living at home. I really hadn't lived at home for about 2 years, just off and on visiting.
What were your feelings about getting drafted to go off to the war? Were you at all patriotic about it, or?
I was afraid the war would be over and I would not get a chance to go. I mean, when you're that age, you don't know what the heck you're thinking.
Mm-hmm.
But the idea is, I've got to go. Besides, when you're at home, at first you have a great time because all these girls just for you, and very soon it's not as much fun as you thought it would be. Most of the guys were gone. I was not the last one, but among the last, because I was 20. I had turned 20 in May of 42. And they were precisely, that was the age they were taking. They didn't want to take 19s or 18s yet, which later on they did.
So, when you got drafted, where did they send you off for training?
When I got drafted, they sent me to Fort Bliss Induction Center. They had a tent city there at Fort Bliss, Logan Heights. They still call it Logan Heights, except the tents are gone. And there they put us all, well, maybe not all, but right away they separated the sheep from the goats. Anybody that was a high school graduate, they took you through a different route. Later on, we'd see all the others on KP working in the kitchen. We were taking tests, all kinds of tests. And from there, they decided that I belonged in the Air Corps, U.S. Air Corps. And they sent me to a base. I don't remember the base, but it was in Utah for assignment. Out there, I went through all batteries of tests, and I stayed there probably a week, no more than a week. In fact, I didn't get any assignment until finally I got kitchen duty, which I pulled for 2 hours because by that time they called me. I need to get ready to catch a train. They were going to put us on a train that was coming by. It was a military train. We were going to Sioux Falls, South Dakota to attend radio school for the Air Force. In the winter, I was going to spend a winter in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. Yes, I spent the winter. I had a great time with that snow for 2 weeks. And after the 2 weeks, I wanted to see the sun so bad. Yeah, I didn't want to see any more snow. It was a hard winter, and I saw what the others were doing outside in the cold weather, and digging ditches and shoveling coal. But we were in our barracks. Either we were in our barracks sleeping, or we were marching on the way to the mess hall or on the way to the classroom. And then we got in the classroom. 8 hours a day we were in the classroom. So actually that hard winter could have been a lot harder if I had been out in the weather.
So they separated people based on their educational level?
Oh yes, right away.
How did that affect the dynamic of the way y'all interacted?
I don't know, because we were only interacted with the ones that got on this side of the line. I can imagine the others out there were grumbling, why don't they put those lazy guys to work? But those guys were probably going to the infantry or to somewhere else.
Whereas, what did you end up doing?
Okay, I was in radio school in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. I slept all day, and I studied from 7. I don't even remember but they had 3 shifts, and we were on the graveyard shift that quit at 6 in the morning. So figure, count back 8 hours. That was the shift that I was in. We had Sundays off. I think we had every other Saturday off. And I stayed there until about the spring. Just as things were getting warm, it was time to go. In the meantime, I took some tests, and they told me that I was a candidate to go to Boca Raton, Florida, for radar school. But before that, a call came for me to report to to Indianapolis, Indiana. And in Indianapolis, they were putting together crews for, we were assigned specifically to air transport, no, to Troop Carrier Command. Troop Carrier Commands were the ones that had those C-47 planes. They were cargo planes, hospital ship planes. They could also carry passengers. They could carry and drop paratroopers. So we were assigned to a plane. The mechanic came from some other school, the pilot and co-pilot navigator from some other school. So they put together the crews, and we started training together, getting to know each other, and telling us what the possibilities were of what we might be doing. Part of what we might be doing, wherever they sent us, was carrying supplies to the front. If we carried gasoline, they would tell us how the gasoline was packaged in the barrels and how to load it. Normally we would not load it, they'd have others to load it, but they wanted us to see how it was done. And if then the plane could be rigged for paratroopers, because the seats would just fold up. For paratroopers, it would go down, and it had a big cable the length of the plane where the paratroopers would hook their, in fact they showed us. And then later on we actually had a chance to train paratroopers at Fort Campbell, Kentucky. We'd drop them at certain places that have a mission to perform. And one time we dropped it was a graduation, part of their graduation. We would drop them at a certain place about, I don't know whether it was 30 or 40 miles from base. We'd drop them there at 10 o'clock. And they'd better report for roll call back at the base at 6 o'clock the following morning. Now, we saw the way they trained those paratroopers, and we were glad that we were on this side rather. I never saw them walk. Always double timing, what they said, double timing, running. Wherever they went, they were running. If somebody stopped them, they'd stop, they'd keep running in place. Saw them training from the towers, rough training. Later on, we had a chance to drop them in combat, but we'll get to that later on. Anyway, our time there was to get acquainted with the crew, get acquainted with each other, get acquainted with the plane, and they would send us on flights so that the navigator would get his practice, and the radio operator was supposed to also be in contact with various stations. And they would try to send the plane to a place where that was close to the home of one or two or three other guys in the crew. Since I was from Texas, they sent me to Texas 3 times. Once to San Antonio, well, I was 600 miles from home. Another one, they sent me to the Rio Grande Valley. I was 700 miles from home. Another one, they sent me to Amarillo. So I never really got close to home. So from the time I left home, I never came home until after I came from overseas.
Wow.
So there at Indianapolis, we had a crew. We didn't belong to any squadron, just a temporary squadron. And then came the news. Something had happened in our invasion of Sicily. A big mistake was made, and our Navy shot down 52 of those transports loaded with paratroopers.
Oh.
So they needed replacements. Well, something.
Yeah, the tape's about to stop, and so I wanted to cut off in the middle of your story.
Okay.
So
Alright, so we gotta
They're-
switch off
they're-
the tape. Okay, so I believe we were at Paratroopers in Sicily. Right, okay, we're recording. So,
When that happened in Sicily, something was happening in the Far East, or the build-up for something was starting, because we soon find out that there in Indianapolis, they had a call for those crews to go to Europe and others to go to the Pacific. And for some reason, all of us wanted to go to Europe, not to the Pacific. And we found out that since we were going to fly those planes across, those planes would need extra tanks. And inside the hold, if they installed 4 tanks in your plane, you were going to Europe. If they installed 8, you were going to the Pacific. So we'd go out there and check, and they had installed 2 in every plane, and well, they still didn't tell you anything. So they made us suffer that way, 2 at a time, until they installed 4 in ours, and then the following day they hadn't installed any more. The following day they hadn't installed any more. So we knew we were going.
why was there that difference in the number of tanks?
The distance you had to fly over water.
Oh, okay, because you're flying. Okay.
Yes. And so what we did, we flew from there to Presque Isle, Maine. At Presque Isle, Maine, we were weathered in for about 2 or 3 days, because we were supposed to go from there to Greenland, and the weather wasn't good. So we decided let's use our armament. I was issued a carbine and a 44 automatic. My crew chief was issued a 44 automatic and a Tommy gun. So we decided, let's go out there and fire our guns. And we went and fired our guns. And we came back and started putting them away, and somebody from the base said, "You're going to clean them, aren't you?" "What?" "You gotta clean them after you fire them." We didn't know how to clean. We had no basic training. We were not prepared for combat. They trained us as radio operators. Nobody was ever going to shoot at us, and we weren't going to shoot at anyone, so why bother with that? Well, he proceeded to tell us, "Didn't they give you a kit?" "Well, they gave us this little box." "Yes, that little box." So he took the kit out, showed us how to take out the thing, put it together, ream it, and then the last one, put a tiny film of oil inside. Says, "This is what you have to do every time after you use your gun. Otherwise, they get rusty, and one of these days you might need it, and then you're in trouble." So our education wasn't neglected there. So we were flying in small hops along what they call the northern route. Later on, it turned out we were the last group to go the northern route, because by that time it was getting to be cold, and they were sending them by the southern route. In the northern route, we'd go from Presque Isle, Maine to Greenland, from Greenland to Iceland, and from Iceland we were going to go to Prestwick, Scotland. And from there we were going to go down to Africa. So we did that, and we found out that in Iceland the GIs were not allowed to go into town. Part of the treaty that we had with somebody, whoever owned Iceland. They said it was sort of nice in town, but they'd go there on business, do your purchase, do whatever you were supposed to do, and then come right back home. But you must not go there for visiting. Later on, the next crew that came in to join us had gone the south route. These people had flown down to Brazil, and from there across to Ascension Island, and then from Ascension Island to Africa. And Ascension Island was a tiny little spot, and if you didn't have a good navigator, you'd miss it. And we found that at least one of those flights had missed it. Anyway, when we were supposed to, on the last leg that that was supposed to get us to Scotland, the weather was bad in Scotland, so they diverted us to an air base called Nuts Corner outside Belfast, Ireland. We spent 2 or 3 days there. We got to go into towns, see the girls, dance, drink. And they were waiting for the weather to be clear, because we had to fly to North Africa. And because the Germans had night fighters in the area, instead of going straight down, we had to go quite a bit off course to the right, out of their range. So in North Africa, we landed at Marrakech, and from there we went to Casablanca, and from there we went to a landing strip from our outfit out in the middle of nowhere. Right over the sand, they would put some. You have probably seen them in movies. The interlaced pieces of steel that turned into a runway. That's where the squadron had been. And then there we found out we had been assigned to we were in Troop Carrier Command, 12th Air Force, 62nd Group. I was sure I knew the name of my squadron, number of my squadron, but I don't. Anyway, that was the end of the road for the time being. Before we left Indianapolis, they gave us something for the crew. They gave us a case of cigarettes, Chesterfield cigarettes. A case contained, I think, 50 cartons.
Wow.
I don't know how many cartons, but each of us got 20 cartons. And that was another battle. That's the real battle that I'm very proud of. That between the Air Forces and the cigarette companies, they were bound and determined to make us all hooked on cigarettes. And they hooked, I think, 90% of the GIs, but they never got me. When I was a kid, I had smoked a little. When I graduated from high school, a girl gave me a Ronson lighter, so naturally I had to stop smoking. I lost the lighter, so then I had no reason for smoking anymore. So, and I'm like President Clinton, who says he didn't inhale. And when somebody saw me smoking, said, "Oh, you're supposed to inhale like this." So I did it. No, sir. You're crazy to inhale that way. So I never smoked cigarettes. I have probably smoked 10 cigarettes in my life. Mostly when I was a kid, and we would try this and try that, just because it was supposed to be done. Anyway, in North Africa, I started giving it away. Eh, Finding out that some of these people that I gave it away to didn't smoke either, or didn't smoke that much, but sold them in the black market. And I figured, well, if they can sell them, I can too. And I wasn't interested in money, but the Arabs around there had beautiful oranges. They had all kinds of fruit. And that was good. The coin of the realm at that time. So we all disposed of our cartons one way or another. The squadron that I was assigned to was one of those squadrons that had participated in the landings in Sicily, that had lost planes and guys, and some that came back with, to hear one of them explain, with a hole that big around. Most of them were drunk and remained drunk for about 2 weeks. I guess they decided that let's let them get over it, because it was a traumatic thing to see your planes shot down right and left. So that happened to my squadron, but I was not a part of the squadron, so I was lucky in that respect. I went there as replacement. Something else that was good that happened. Early on, I don't know if early in the war or before the war, they had a bunch of sergeants flying gliders, because we were going to use gliders for many purposes, which we did in the invasion. And later on they decided since these guys had been taught to fly gliders, and they wanted pilots quickly, and they couldn't train a pilot that quickly, they decided to let them be pilots. So they were training them in our planes. And by regulations, every time a plane flew, it had to have a full crew, full complement. So they gave these guys a lot of time in what they call shooting landings. That means you take off and go around the field and land until it's considered a landing, then you take off. That's all you do for hours. And sometimes you land the right way, sometimes almost front way. So the first thing that happened to us, we lost our plane. The crew was split. The plane went to the old-timers that were there, and the old-timers were trying to also train these glider pilots. So when they assigned those glider pilots to fly the plane, and they had to have a full complement, they would assign the rookies, the newest guys, the ones that have nothing to do, and they're expendable. So that was the most dangerous thing I did in the war, actually. Shooting landings with those guys, which later, much later, served me very well. At the time, the war was slowing down in Europe, and they were counting points to try to get the guys back to the country. I had more points, more hours of flying time than some of the old-timers that had been there when I reported. So I was sent back to the U.S., and those guys still stayed there. So you never know. So we did a lot of flights out of that place, which did not have a name. It had a code name, but it did not have a name. We'd fly. Sicily was already taken, except for a northeasternmost corner where the armies were trying to push the Germans out. And in the meantime, one of the bombers that had flown from Africa on a bombing mission, and on the way back was so disabled it could not make it all the way. And there was a cotton field in Sicily, and he belly landed there, and all the crew was saved. So then the Air Force decided this is a good place for a landing strip. So they built a landing strip there, and that was our next base. By that time, the activity in Africa was gone, so they didn't need that base there. They needed us farther close to the front. So we went to that place called Gela, G-E-L-A. When we'd come back to Africa, we'd come to Algiers. Algiers was the big city, the big base, the main base. Any time the army needed something, Algiers was where they would have it. And in Algiers, at the base, at any base, whenever you were caught on the base at the time of retreat, when the flag is coming down, I don't care how big a hurry you're in, you stop, face the flag, remove your hat. Or if it's a garrison cap, you keep it on and salute. You get tired of it. The only time I really enjoyed it in Algiers, I don't remember what the name of the base was, but it was a huge. It was like being in this country. It was a big base. So they'd play the God Save the King and lower the British flag, and then they'll play the Marseillaise, lower the French flag, and then they'd play our own stars and the Star Spangled Banner. It would just set tingles down your back. If you were not patriotic ever before, boy, that time you felt it.
That make a difference having it lined up with all the other anthems.
Oh yes. So that was a chore that became a real pleasant experience.
How was interaction between the various nationalities there? How between
the various nationalities got along well, which wasn't the case among the various branches of our armed services. Air Force people wore a distinctive type of jacket. In fact, you still see it in the movie, what they call a bomber jacket. Even we who were not the pilots, we would wear that jacket with a big insignia that you'd get somebody to paint it for a horrendous amount of money. But anytime they were in a bar, and it didn't happen to me too much because I wasn't the type that went to bars. I didn't do much drinking. There was invariably a talk about the Army or about the Navy. I don't think we had Marines there, but it was Army, Navy, and Air Force. By that time, we were unofficially called the U.S. Air Force, but actually, officially, we were the U.S. Army Air Forces. It wasn't until I got out of the service that the Air Force became a separate branch. All the time I thought I belonged to the Air Force. No, I belonged to the Air Forces of the Army. But when they'd see those jackets, whether you were a soldier or a sailor, you'd have to go out there and pick up a fight. So generally those people didn't go into the bars unless they were willing to pick up a fight. So we got along well with the British. The French, they didn't have too many French troops there. Uh, Remember, Algiers was still a colony of France, so they had many activities. The city was very French and very African. And in most cases, the real fun places were off limits. And if you think you can go there regardless of what the sign says, no, the MPs had other ideas. And I mean, with the MPs, you didn't play around. They'd have billy clubs, and I think they had a quota of the number of times they had to use those, because they used them very liberally. So we respected them.
How about between the American armed forces? How did were they well integrated? Did everybody get along well together? People from different states, different races. How was that dynamic?
Well, they were in different units, doing different things. I think at a big air base, say a bomber base, where you have so much personnel, and if you have the kind of runway that the bombers use, then you're going to have bombers from your country and from other countries too. That's probably where they mix more. We dealt a lot with the British because there were some commandos. Later on, when we were in Italy, there were some commandos that we would drop. We'd go across the Aegean Sea, I think it's the Aegean Sea, to Yugoslavia. We'd drop them. They'd go out there, work undercover, work with the partisans. Tito was leading a bunch of partisans. Mihailovich was leading another bunch. We were supplying both of them. And then finally it was decided that the one that was going to win was Tito. So I think we cut off the Mihailovich group and just dropped to Tito. And yeah, he did come out ahead. In fact, he was a leader there in Yugoslavia. He kept the peace. I'm sure he kept it with a very, very tight fist, but he kept the peace. And there were some of those that we'd see over and over, some of those British agents. We'd drop them, and 2 weeks later, we'd drop them again, because they'd make their way back to bring in, I guess, their reports. At our base in Africa, and also at our base in Sicily, there was an anti-aircraft battery that was manned by the British. In fact, one time I worked on the tower. I knew nothing about tower work, but the planes were practicing with gliders. They would tow the gliders, and once they got at airspeed, they'd release them, and then the plane would come by at a certain point and drop the line. And we, with an Aldis lamp, signal lamp, would tell them where was the right place. When we give them the green, then they drop the line. And there was an anti-aircraft battery there, and they would have their tea. In fact, I started drinking tea, and I liked it. I guess I didn't like it enough, because I drink it just occasionally now. I don't drink much tea. But when we interacted with the Australians, there was talk. The British are going to fight this war to the last American. They'd say, the British are going to fight this war to the last Australian. You know, each group, it's always talking about that one, that other one. With the British, what we interacted was that those Australians are so stupid they cannot follow directions. there's always the idea of one group looking down on another group. And not anything serious, but I imagine at times it could get serious. But that was generally rather good interaction. Sometimes we could not understand their English and they could not understand ours, but then that was their fault.
How about within the American ranks, though? Was there, while you were climbing the ranks of the American Army, was there a lot of attention given to the fact that you're a Latino, or was there a lot of discrimination within the ranks, segregation at all, or did everybody pretty much get along together?
I did not see another Latino. There was none in my squadron. There were very few, and I imagine where that discrimination started was back in Fort Bliss or in Utah, where they separated. They were tracking us in a way. The high school graduates, and there were not too many high school graduate Latinos. That's how I happened to fall in this other group. So as far as the Latinos that were put in the infantry, they probably figured, yeah, all the gringos went out there, and I was among them. So I did not notice any discrimination. The only discrimination I noticed was by the absence. There was a pilot there that I called Lopez, but his name was Lopes. He was from California, and he didn't speak Spanish, so he was Lopes. And no other. We had a black battalion stationed close by, and what they did, they were guards, perimeter guards. Remember, at that time, they were not allowed to do combat. Now, back in Britain, things were different from what we hear, because our GIs had so much money, much more than the British airmen. And they claimed that they had the first call on the women. That's what prompted those people to say that what's wrong with the Yanks is that they're oversexed, overpaid, and over here. But I did not notice any of that. When I told you about I did not drink. I did not go to the bar. That was part of my education. Back when I missed the school, a year of schooling, I used to say I missed a year of education. No, I missed a year in schooling, because I worked with a lot of migrant workers in California, Mexicans, not Mexican Americans, Mexicans. Beautiful people, smart, well educated, but they had the habit of wine. I mean, without wine, nothing happened. So I could see this beautiful guy right now, and by midnight when he came back from town, he was an animal. And I think that had more to do with my not drinking than anything else. I saw what drink would do to a perfectly beautiful human being. So later on, I stopped saying that I had missed a year of education. I figured I missed a year of schooling, but man, did I get an education. So in Italy, when I mean, they almost think there's something wrong with you if you don't drink wine. I would drink wine, not enough to get drunk. The one thing that I need to try one of these days, I think, is gin, because I've always liked something strong with Coke, or like whiskey or bourbon with 7-Up, or out there something stronger like cognac with something else. But this time when somebody gave me cognac without anything, and I drank, and it was so hard that I picked up a glass that I thought looked like 7-Up, took a big swig, and it was gin. I haven't tasted gin since then, and I don't know how it tastes. That's why one of these days I'm going to taste and see what I've been doing away with. It's funny what you pick up as education that later on you realized it was part of your education, but at that time it was just a little quirk of something. Anyway, Italy, in Sicily, at least I could talk to the people. Since I speak Spanish, I found it rather easy to make myself understood in Italian. I maybe didn't speak it worth a darn, but if you can get your point across, hey, that's communication. And we got to visit many places there. Went to Palermo, went to Catania, went to most of the cities, all on business, because things were slow, so we'd carry things from here to there. It was when there was an active front that we would perform our two most important things. Either carry paratroopers to drop them behind the lines, which presented some danger, or land at a makeshift field to pick up wounded and bring them back. And right there, we learned what they in the service call the triage system. From the wounded, they figure about 1/3 of them can benefit from good medical attention. So those, they send them out by plane. Those are probably going to make full recovery. And those that have a little something that you can do there for them right there. And those that are so far gone, nothing that you could do would separate them. So the ones we dealt with were the ones that were the savable. And yet we started seeing some that were in real bad shape, torn to pieces, but they were savable because our medicine by that time had progressed, and the fact that we carried them, they would get from the field to a good hospital in rather quick order rather than in 3 or 4 or 5 days. That made the difference. Or I was not in the invasion of southern France, but as the patent armies were going up faster than the supply lines could keep up with it, we were carrying fuel for them. And we would land, the planes had the advantage of landing they didn't need too much space to land. So we'd land, roll those things out, and get out of there as quickly as you could, because they were still shooting out there close by. Or flying out of Italy, we made a lot of missions, also dropping people behind enemy lines. They were the ones that were doing the dangerous work. And we had we had maps of where their anti-aircraft artillery was, and you'd sort of try to avoid it. They'd shoot at you, but you knew, or at least they had told you that you felt that you were out of range. Sometimes you see them much closer, figure they didn't give us the right information. No, the thing that you were really afraid of at night was night fighters, because by that time the Germans had radar in the planes. Before that, their night fighters only had infrared lights, and through infrared lenses they could see you. But later on, they had just as good radar as we had. But by that time they didn't have as many. We had already done a good job of beating them at the air war.
So how long were you in the theater over there?
Actually, from the time I landed in North Africa, all that was considered the theater of operations. That was it was in the summer, but I don't remember what month. But it was in 1942. No, 43. 1943. And went to Sicily, then went to southern Italy, close to Bari. By that time, the Germans there were no danger, but Bari was a port, and one of our convoys had just reached Bari, and the Germans knew about it and knew what it was carrying munitions. So that night they raided, and they confused our radar by dropping foil. I don't think foil had been used before. The foil just looked like static, so our radar operators were not that practiced in that. They really got fooled. And from there, we moved farther up to Siena. I was at Siena for a long time, and then to Rome. No, to Rome first. I think Siena's farther on. That's where we were. That was a different campaign from there on. We were the Rome-Arno campaign. If we had gone farther north, it would have been the Po Valley. I didn't get in. I don't have a ribbon for the Po Valley campaign. So there was a lot of, most of the activity was evacuating wounded and taking in supplies. And when the invasion from across the English Channel came, and our planes participated in that, and I got sick. I didn't get into it. My sister later told me that everybody back home, that was a big secret when it was going to happen. Well, everybody back home knew when it was going to. I think it was announced or something. It was a matter of one day or the next. Then my mother had her praying on her knees for 2 days that I would not participate in that invasion. And sure enough, I got sick and I did not participate. As it turned out, none of the planes from my squadron got shut down. So by that time, things were slowed down, but everything was gearing up for the Pacific. In fact, there were some that were out there that were transferred directly from there to the Pacific. with no chance to come back home. In my case, I didn't come back home for good or officially, but they were starting to furlough people, to give them a chance to go home. And they would do it on the basis of points. Different people had different types of points. The fighter pilots had 30 missions, and bomber pilots had less missions. Anyway, when you reach the equivalent of what had been determined, in our case, we had missions and sorties, but what counted was the number of hours. You had to have flown 1,000 hours to be eligible to be returned. And because of those dirty assignments that they gave me early on with a glider pilot, I had 1,100 hours. So I said goodbye to a lot of guys that had been there 2 years before I got there. You never know how things work out.
So were you just furloughed, or did you get sent back?
Well, I went back to the States, gave me a 30-day furlough at home, and then they sent me to rest and rehabilitation at Santana, California, for 30 days. Before that, out of Italy, they had sent me for 1 week of rest and rehabilitation at Capri. So I enjoyed that very much. So after my rest and rehabilitation at Santana, California, I was assigned to Waco. And I didn't know yet whether I was subject to assignment in the Far East. And just about every morning we'd get up and count the points as though something had happened magically overnight, because they were announcing that by that time the ones with this many points would be eligible. So out of Waco, in Waco there was nothing to do, just to behave yourself, and once you get out of your bed and make your bed and get out of there, you better get out of there. Don't come back, because if you come back, they'll find something for you to do, either to march or to do work. So we'd disappear. And it was that time when going to the PX, they had some corncob pipes, and some of us bought some pipes just for the heck of it. And I, who had never smoked, I started smoking a pipe, and I smoked a pipe for the next 20 years, until my son did a research paper as a senior in high school about the dangers of smoking, including pipes. He forced me to quit. And so from there, they just sent me here and there out of, not stationed, but on a trip, what they call training trips. I guess just to keep you busy, to stay out of trouble. But one of those times they did assign me to Biloxi, Mississippi. And Biloxi, Mississippi was a horrible place. The base itself was ugly. Later on, they sent me to Louisiana, North Monroe, Louisiana, just a little bit here and a little bit there. There, out of Monroe, Louisiana, I got the notice to report to Fort Randolph Field for separation. So that was my promotion to a civilian. So before I went home, I had my ticket from there to Marfa. But before I went home, I took a bus to Austin. I had applied for admission to the university just to see how my application was doing. on the day I got there at the registrar's office, they had a stack about that high of applications of transcripts that had come in that day, and mine wasn't up.
Yeah.
So I got things settled there right away, and went back to San Antonio and took a train back home. I had been away from home 3 years.
Wow.
Never got a chance to visit.
So what was it like coming back? Did you find it changed a lot after the war, or what was it like coming back home, basically?
So many of the ones that were my close friends had either come back and gone somewhere else, or had not come back. So that there wasn't much left. One of the things that's has sort of figured important in my life. My father was a hunter, an avid hunter. He was going to take me hunting in Redford. And then he got sick and he never recovered. He died. And I moved to Marfa. My godfather, who had a son just 1 year older than I, was going to take us hunting. And he went into the service, and so did I. And when I came back, he had died. So the two logical people to take me hunting were gone. So I've never had a yen for hunting. I have worked in places where if you're not a hunter, you're not a man. And they never could convince me to go hunting. I just didn't never had any interest. Later on, I found out that my brother was the same. That he never had gone hunting. So I was surprised that I have a son, my second son, who moved to Colorado. He's an avid hunter. You figure. So Marfa was changed. The air base was still there. I had worked at that air base between the CCC and the military. I had worked there at the base. They were constructing it, and it was also being face down. There were not too many military people, and they gave every veteran an insignia that he was a veteran. That for some reason we never liked them, and to show you that we didn't like them, we called it the Ruptured Duck. So of course you never get caught wearing a Ruptured Duck. I don't know really what it was about it that figured out. I know I'm a veteran. I don't have to show anybody. And very few of my friends that went to the war failed to return. Some returned slightly wounded. One of them, with a cousin of mine, with mental problems. But by and large, most of them came back. And I don't think they stayed there for the same reason that there were still not too many jobs there.
What were your expectations coming back after the war? What did you set out as priorities for what you wanted to do with your life at that point?
Well, one of the priorities that I set out, I was going back to school, and I was going to the University of Texas. And my regret was that when I got out of the military at Randolph Field in San Antonio and I came to check, the university was on a trimester system. And the university was going to start, the session was going to start in 2 weeks. So I wasn't going to have much time at home. But I had to. I had to come back to school. So, saying goodbye to my mother was the hardest thing. I'm sure it was for her. I'm sure she wondered why, after not seeing us for a long time, does he want to go away again? I didn't want to go that soon, but I had to. And I tell a story about 3 other friends that were coming with me. But they had the same problem. They could not go just then. They were going to wait. And they're still waiting. They never made it. So I'm glad I made it. If I had not, I don't think I would have made it.
So you came to the University of Texas then?
So I came.
What was Austin like back in those days?
Austin didn't know whether it was a big town or a small city. It wasn't a small city at all, but people thought they should be called a city. And at that time, El Paso and Austin were running a race, see who would get to 100,000 sooner. And later, 2 or 3 years later, in the 50s, where they had a census, El Paso in the count got ahead, but then Austin got permission to count the students, so it got ahead. I don't know why they were so anxious, but the Austin I knew in 1945 and the Austin I know now have changed so much.
How have they changed?
Traffic, buildings, tall buildings. Austin didn't have any tall buildings. The tall buildings downtown were, I think, 4 stories, 5 stories high. When I came to the university, my big problem was housing. Housing was very scarce. And I was naive enough to believe when the registrar told me, if you don't have an Austin address, we cannot register you. Later on, I found out that a lot of people didn't have an address, but they gave an address. They took it.
Why wouldn't they give you one?
No, somebody just gave an address when they didn't have one. And
people just lied about it?
and nobody checked.
Nobody checked.
And I thought I had to be very truthful. And so, do you know where the Cambridge Towers are?
Cambridge Tower.
On 19th and Lavaca?
No, I don't.
Do you know where the state museum is?
Yeah.
Okay, right in back of the state museum.
Okay.
It's a big condos. Well, across the street, there's a house. It's still there. And they had a sign, room for rent, which, as I approached the house, the lady was tearing down the sign. She had just rented it. And she said no, she didn't have any. And she sort of felt sorry for me. And then she asked me to come in. And when I came in, she had a little girl. And the little girl just came and hugged me. And she said, well, you know, little dogs and little children, they can detect a good person. I should like to help you. You would like to live in a closet, would you? I said, well, show me the closet. So it was one of these closets that's walk-in closet. Half underground, half top. Figured that there's room for a cot. And I could put my clothes. I didn't have too many clothes. string something right above the bed, and there I can hang my clothes. I said, how much do you want? She said, $10. I said, I'll take it. So I lived there the first semester. It was very, very scarce. Later on, because it was so scarce, right where they have the parking lot for the big dorm, used to be intramural fields. But out back of the intramural fields, they put some hutments. They call it cliff courts. It was those quarter-inch square things, but they put two of them together, and each one of them, each double one would house 6 guys in 3 double bunks.
Wow.
So that's where I lived most of the time until I moved to a co-op, Campus Guild co-op.
So what did you study in college, and what profession did you go into?
Okay, when I came to college, when I was at New Mexico State, I did well in math. I did well in physics. I had ideas that I wanted to be an engineer, probably an electrical engineer, and that's what I registered for here at the university, electrical engineering. And I did 2 semesters, and I found it harder and harder. The second part of chemistry was hard. And then when I took an advanced calculus, I took a test and did well, and immediately after that we got into something that I had no idea what they were talking about. And at that time I decided this is a good time for me to drop the course. So I dropped it without prejudice. And then by then I decided, no, I think I'm in the wrong field. I did not have enough background in the math and the sciences. I thought I did, but I didn't. So I switched to sociology. And that's where I got my degree in sociology.
And what did you do after college?
Well, I couldn't get any job related to sociology. I became very interested. I had been interested since I was in high school in juvenile delinquency. And there was a job related to that in El Paso. And it didn't pay hardly anything. And I found out that those jobs didn't really pay much. So I started taking education courses so that I could start teaching and see what else I did. Well, I started teaching and I liked it. And I kept on teaching, and I got my master's in that. Later on, I became principal. And
where were you principal?
In Harlingen. We lived in Harlingen for about 10 years. And
I'm sorry, did you have a family as well at this time?
Yes. Yes, the first year that I taught, I went to El Paso, married my girl that I had met here at the university, and brought her down to the Rio Grande Valley. And very soon we had a child, and soon after that we had another one. So for quite some time we had 2 children, and then we had another one. And then much later we had another one, so 4 children. And I worked mostly in education. Later on, they were starting a program on this war on poverty situation, that each county was organizing putting together a non-profit corporation. I applied for the one in Hidalgo County, where Enberg is the county seat, McAllen, mission, and I got elected to that one. So I served there for 3 years until somebody, a friend of mine who was working here in Austin at a Southwest Development Educational Laboratory, they were doing research and development, curriculum development, asked me to come to Austin. I had always wanted to come to Austin, so I came to Austin. And I worked at that for about 3 years. And at that time, the funding for that laboratory was sort of running out. So they let out several people, including me. In the meantime, I had been taking graduate courses. I had already had my master's, taken my master's here, but I was taking further advanced courses. I decided, well, my wife was working. She was also working at that laboratory, writing curriculum. We decided that I should go work on my doctorate full time. So I went full time, and in 1976 I got my PhD. After that, I worked a year developing a program of counseling and tutoring for St. Edward's University.
Tape's on?
Yeah, so do you want to put on one end?
Yeah.
Where was I?
I wanted to ask you about the changes in the lives of Latinos in the decades following World War II, how that changed things, particularly in your area of the country. You used to have Mexican-American schools. How has life changed?
Back in Marfa, I really don't know. One of the things I do know is that at City Hall or at the courthouse, when I write for papers, there's generally a Hispanic that's in charge, a county clerk or something, which was completely unknown at that time. A Hispanic never got any of those posts, even though they were in the majority. Now, my first year of teaching, I went down to a little town in the valley called Elsa. Elsa, the reason I quit it, well, I finished the year, but that was a segregated system. That little school was for Mexicans only, and the other one was for the Anglos. And I had talked with the superintendent and urging him to give it a try. He said, before I give it a try, I'll go to my ranch in West Texas and raise cattle. And he did. He went back to West Texas and raised cattle. Now, those towns there had Mexican-American majority, some just the majority, some a huge majority, and yet not a single elected official was Hispanic. But during my stay in that area, things started changing. They tell a story which is probably not true, but could be, that in Harlingen, a group of Mexicans would get together about whom they wanted appointed or named or just asking to run. They'd get together with the Anglos. In the past, they had gotten together so that the Anglos would tell them who they were running. Just let them know who was running, period. And this time, when they told them who was running, then one of the guys from the group said, well, we have been meeting and we think so and so should run, which was something not scripted. And then the chair of that little assembly said, let's take a little break, and I want everybody to caucus. Remember, this is a story, not supposed to be factual, but it could be. So one of the groups, one of the Mexicans in the group said, ¿Qué es caucus? Said, no sé, pero es algo como botana. Do you know what botana is? If you're having a big barbecue or something, it's going to be ready in an hour. But botana is something that's ready to eat right now, little tidbits.
Okay.
So that, if it's not true, which I'm sure it's not, but it's indicative of how really unsophisticated in politics these people were. But they were waking up, and it was dangerous. And they started running, and they started electing their own, slowly. And now it has changed quite a bit. Now, before my time, there was a swimming pool there at Harlingen, and that was segregated. And the leaders of the Mexican-American community had gone to the leaders in the Anglo community to indicate we want access. That's a public pool, separated with our taxes. So they worked out a compromise that, yes, on a certain day, the Mexicans could go in. Well, by that time, there were some young, fiery Mexicans that decided, okay, we'll do something. So that day, they went into the pool. They all had soap and a GI brush. They started soaping themselves. They claim that is true. I didn't see it because I wasn't there at that time. So that threw a monkey wrench in the thing. So they still wanted the pools segregated, so they called it a private pool. They went through a lot of things. It was not until I went there in 1950, and it was a few years before that actually the pool became integrated. But before that, back home in Marfa, there was a pool that it belonged to the base, Fort D.A. Russell. Only their families and their guests could use it. Later on, when they closed the base, the city operated it, and no Mexicans were allowed during the bulk of the week. But on a certain day, I think Wednesday or Friday, when the water was going to be changed, they would let them use it that day. They'd clean the pool and fill it up, and then the following day, then the anglers would start using it. Well, some of them, braver than I, would jump the fence, and they'd be the first ones in the water the following morning before the pool opened. Just, quiet rebellion, but just gaining a little more courage until you could do something. And when I came to Marfa, to the Mexican school, which we started calling it the Blackpool School because the principal, we liked the principal. He was Mr. Blackpool. He had been there forever. And the name stuck. Later on, they officially named it Blackpool School. Some of the parents they had heard about Del Rio. That in Del Rio they had segregated them, so they created their own district. So they decided we should create our own district. And a delegation from Del Rio, from San Felipe, came to tell them, don't. Because you'll have your own district, but it'll be on this side of town. The bulk of the houses, your tax base is on that side of town. You're cutting your own throat. Because that's what had happened to them. San Felipe got separated from the Del Rio district. But then the tax base was in Del Rio. San Felipe was considered the poorest district. Later, much later, when a base was established there, and the children of that base were bused through the San Felipe district to the Del Rio district, because each of those kids carried a big chunk of money, I think 20,000 or so for the district. Until the group out there, by that time they were wise in the ways of the law, sued and found that there was a law that you cannot transport children across another district to take them to a third district. So then those kids had to go to that district. And here in Austin, when we were students, when two Hispanics got together, the first thing, how's discrimination back there? That was the talk among us. And the only ones that said there never was any discrimination in their area was people from Laredo and the people from Brownsville. Later on we found out, yeah, there was. But they just hadn't noticed it. Well, we organized a club here at the university, the Alba Club. Alba was the dawn because we felt this was the dawning of a new era. And just at about that time, the Attorney General of Texas had answered a question from the Del Rio district. They wanted to segregate the Mexicans in their district. But the superintendent of public instruction, at that time, the organization of the schools was different. Now they have a commissioner. At that time, the superintendent of public instruction was an elected official. Had told them that was illegal. So those people asked the Attorney General for an opinion. How can we, or what basis can we do it legally? He said, give them a test in English. If they don't pass it. So the Alba Club asked for the Attorney General to come and speak to the club. And in that club we had about 2 or 3 guys who were already in law school and 2 or 3 others who were pre-law. And we had our sponsor, Dr. Sanchez here at the university, who had been a fighter from way back. And they grilled that Attorney General. They had him squirming. He reversed the decision and apologized to them. So since then, that group had been active in that. Now, something else that they did in several areas, like the New Braunfels, where they would not serve Mexicans in a certain restaurant, certain cafe. A bunch of people got together to go out there to be served, or they were willing to be there all day. And it's here Taylor, same way. Many of us didn't go because we didn't have the money to, in case they served us, we didn't have any money to pay. So there was something around there. There's still a lot of old timers my age that came here to the university that said they had a hard time finding housing because they were discriminated against. I don't feel that I was discriminated against here. And back home at the theater, we had a theater for Mexicans. because it showed Mexican movies. But we could go to the other one. But when I came back from the service on leave, still wearing my uniform, I was dating a girl from Alpine. We went to the show at the theater, and the usher came and said, "You have to go upstairs." Why? Said, it's better out there. No, I said, I like it here. No, but you can't. Why? Well, let me get the manager. So the manager came, and he said, if you don't move, I'll call the sheriff. And by that time I had come back from the war. I was wearing the uniform. I was not about to. And I said, okay, you call the sheriff, but I'm not moving. He called the sheriff or didn't, I don't know, but nobody ever came to bother me. Now, before that, when I was in the CCC, and there was a truck that would pick us up to bring us to town, as we went through Marathon, no, not Marathon. I don't remember whether it was Marathon or Sanderson. I think it was Marathon. Had a sign that said, "No Mexicans allowed at the restaurant." Of course, the truck never stopped there. This time, we were going back from our homes back to the camp. And we noticed that the truck stopped there. So, remember I told you that people who were seniors there, had been there over the allotted 2 years, were designated as what did I tell you? Senior assistant or something.
Leader assistant, something. Assistant.
They had a designation.
Yeah.
Okay, this guy was with us. And he had already talked to the truck driver. And I think they had sort of cleared it with our commander back at the base, back at the camp. He said, let's go for a drink. The first thing he did, tore down the side, put it under his arm, and we went in, ordered something, we were served, and nothing more was said. And I have a copy of a newspaper that had a picture of a sign from Dallas, and I don't know what year it was, but it was around 1950. It said, "Mexicans and dogs not allowed in this place." And it's a big one with big signs. On the road between here and El Paso, if you go by parts of West Texas, the Odessas, those had a great reputation for being highly prejudiced. I had never had an experience because I did not travel that road. The road I traveled a lot was from the valley along the river, Highway 90 to El Paso, and nothing ever happened. But right now, you can probably still find people that will tell you that at a certain place, either they don't serve you or they'll serve you in the kitchen or whatever. It's still going on, and much of it goes on very subtly, I'm sure. And this thing about in the service, I said, maybe the segregation happened at an early point, like either Fort Bliss, where they decide you go into this and you go into that. My brother, who was 11 years older than I, and he had six children, and they drafted him. And he took the training. Of course, it was going to be the infantry. And he feels that the sergeant did him a great favor. Because they fired different guns. They fired machine gun. And said, you have to choose a specialty. You're going to be in everything, but you have to choose what you really want to be assigned. My brother said, I want the machine gun. Later on, the sergeant said, the machine gunner is the first one that they go after because he does so much damage. My advice to you is don't choose that. So he chose mortars. And when he got into the thick of things, he found out that was true, because you go after that machine gunner. He said that was almost sure death. Yes, you do a lot of damage, but then all those sharpshooters have their assignment to get you first. So it works. There's such a thing as a system, and there's such a thing as individual people in the system who make it worse or make it better. There's always somebody that will help. One of the things that happened or did happen to me, I didn't pay much attention to it until much later, but I was a good student in high school. I don't think I had any C's ever in high school, A's or B's. The teachers liked me, the superintendent liked me, and I don't remember anybody ever talking to me about going to college. So when I became a school teacher, and later on as a principal, I don't know how many people I talked into thinking about going to college. Don't think about it when you're a senior. Think about it now, because the courses you take will put you in or put you out. So I'm wondering whether at that time it was discrimination. My wife, who said at the time when everybody had a study period, she went to El Paso High School. She never had a study period because her counselor told her to take the commercial course, because she wasn't going to college. And her mother had said, you're going to college, so you take the other course. So in order to please both of them, she took the commercial and the prep. And when she graduated and went right there to UTEP, she was the only one of her group that went to UTEP. Later on, she found out that some of them went later, but many of them never did, even though the college was right there. So right there, the counseling also has a lot to do with it. So it's there. I try to keep that from my kids, but we were in Harlingen and we moved to McAllen. My son was going to be a senior. Well, that summer it was announced that my son had made merit finalist. And later on, it turned out he was a merit scholar. And in McAllen, they knew who their merit scholars were going to be. And they weren't. So one of them made merit scholar, and an outsider, my son, and another outsider who came from somewhere else. So the minute he made merit scholar, he was bombarded by letters from all kinds of universities, but particularly Michigan State. Michigan State would probably write him 2 a day. So he made the application and everything, and they sent what was needed, and he filled out the application for assistance and for admission and turned it over to the counselor. And on the day of the deadline, they called, what happened? Did Hector change his mind? never sent the application. We turned it in. So we went to the counselor's office. Oh, yes. Oh, yes, today, oh, yesterday was. Later on, we found out, I didn't know that counselor at all, but we found out that she was prejudiced as all get out. There had never been any officers, student officers, Hispanics in that high school, although it had many, many of them, maybe a majority. So finally it was decided, since they had a system of deciding who was eligible to run, the group decided to put up one of their own. And he was not sanctioned, but somehow they got to make it legal for him to run. So he ran, and he got elected class president, and this lady resigned. Now that was, we were told that we had already left. We were here in Austin. So little things, and it happens very, very early. And sometimes, maybe because I didn't get any of that my first 6 years of schooling, I didn't notice. But at that time, I think they start giving it to you in small doses. So you think it's part of the normal. Isn't that the way it's always done? So there are people that will still tell you that it's still around. Don't think that it's gone. I don't know.
I think we've gone through pretty much the whole form. Was there anything else you want to add at all, or that you feel we haven't addressed?
No, the minute I step out of the building, I'll think about some things. You know how it is.
Well, we might call you back to ask you some more questions too. So you might want to think about something you didn't address. But thank you for your time, Mr. Lujan, and thank you very much.
Oh, okay.
And I guess we can kill it.
Thank you.
I guess